Something a lot of beginners can often get wrong is forgetting to listen to themselves properly when they're playing. So I want to give you some tips on some of the most important things that you should always be keeping your ears focused on. Your ears are one of the most important tools for giving yourself feedback on your playing. Now, it does take practice to get better at this, especially when you're a beginner, when you're learning by yourself. And I know the feeling too, that your mind there's so much to focus on. You're thinking really hard about what your hands are doing, how they fit together. That's tough. Remembering the notes on the keyboard, remembering what to play and the fingers, thinking about your technique or reading. But at the earliest stage you want to start always reminding yourself and really training yourself to get in the habit of listening to your own playing, checking for mistakes, checking things that are going wrong, or how you can improve what you're getting right. Always keeping your attention on the actual sound of the music. Okay, so I've got a list of things to listen out for that you should be aware of. Now, the first one may sound obvious and it's the simplest thing, but you'd be surprised when people are so focused on the visual side, remembering the notes or looking at the notes, just looking at what their hands are doing and not actually really listening to the music. They don't sometimes hear when they've played or repeatedly play wrong notes. Sometimes your brain can trick you into thinking you've played the right thing because maybe you think your hand looks like it's in the right place, or you've just misremembered and think that's the right thing you've played, or you've misread it. Sometimes it might be, for example, that you're so focused on the right hand that you started playing something wrong in the left hand without noticing. And the trouble is, if you don't notice a mistake, you can't go and fix it, and then you're not practicing the right thing. So always let your ears be that first test to check if you've got something right. Really get familiar with the sound of the piece that you're playing. Listen to recordings and things. That way you know whether you've matched it, you know what you're aiming for, and then always be sure to go and fix any mistakes. Being really familiar with the sound of the music that you're learning and keeping your ears open to it as you're playing is a really useful way to help guide what we're doing, to remind us what's coming next, and to help memorize things. I'm going to talk about some more specific things that you can do later on in the video, but for beginners, a great place to start with that is simply just listening out to things like the range that you're playing in and the way that the notes may move up or down. So with the range, we need to get used to the kind of sound of this area versus the middle versus the low end of the piano. Be familiar being able to find those things. And then if you're hearing in your head what should come next, for example, a low note, you're going to be reminded which direction to move. Always keep the sound of the music in your mind. And the same with remembering where to move in a melody. So initially, a good thing to start with is just whether the notes move up or down, or we hear the same notes again. So for example, this melody leaps down, climbs up, comes back down, and then goes back up again. Even as a beginner, just trying to latch on to the general shape, the way that that moves is a good place to start. The trick is to actually make sure you're paying attention to that stuff. Remember to actively think about and hear in your head what's going to happen next in the melody or whatever you're playing to help guide you what to play. And that's going to affect how you play it as well. I think the most common thing I see is beginners getting the rhythm wrong or just slightly off, the feel of it off, and not realizing. Sometimes it's getting the rhythm completely wrong or just slightly different, playing a note late after the beat, or maybe it's rushing part of the melody, or even adding or skipping entire beats. But it's also things like pausing and speeding up and slowing down. And again, this is usually because the dominating thought in our mind is getting the right notes in the right order, and that's great to start with, but at some stage of learning a new piece of music, we really need to think and make a priority in our mind how fundamental to the sound of the music the rhythm is. It's so important to making it sound right that we need to first confidently know what it's meant to sound like, have the rhythm clearly in our head and be aiming to match it, as well as listen out to our own playing to check that we're getting it right. Of course, to actually perform the rhythm accurately, we need to have good technique and things in order to control it. So if you know that you're not playing it right, then maybe you need to slow it down, look at technique issues that you're having, or try and find an exercise to practice the thing that you're working on better. I have a whole other video I'll link to down below with some really helpful tips to improve your rhythm. The next thing is listening out to how you're actually going to perform the piece, the details of how you're going to play every note. And when I say listening here, I really mean hearing the sound that we want to create in our head and then listening that we are actually creating that sound. And this is so important for actually bringing the music to life, making it sound expressive, making it sound musical. If what you're playing feels a bit flat or lifeless or just doesn't sound quite right, that can often be because, again, you're focused on pushing the buttons, the mechanics, and not imagining how the music should sound. There's lots of things that affect this, and I'm talking about things like articulation, so how you play each note, whether you're playing staccato or legato. Now that may mean overall how the whole thing sounds. It may just be one section, or it may be an individual note, how you attack an individual note to create the desired effect. Listening for how your touch affects the sound and the clarity in your playing. It might be about the emphasis that you put on particular notes on particular parts of the rhythm. It's about things like dynamics, so broadly whether you're playing loudly or softly. It can be about the dynamics of individual notes, individual parts of a phrase, or sometimes the dynamics might wave. All this comes together and becomes part of your phrasing, how you shape what you play. Where you lift off and take a breath between phrases. It can be how you choose to accent or lift off one particular note. Might be the difference between this and this. So on that second one, I accented that note and then I lifted the note earlier to leave a breath, a gap, before the next bit. You have to listen to your pedaling too, when to lift off, when to put your foot down to create the desired effect. And things like where we might slow down at the end of a section or the end of the song. You have to have a feel for that in your head first. And of course, you can get that experience by listening to music, actively listening to music and picking up on elements of the musical language, elements of certain styles, and the different nuances that bring your playing to life. Of course, we need to get familiar with the control and the techniques we need to actually perform those sounds, but they're just never going to come out really if you're not imagining that sound you want to create first. Now this works much better, it's much easier to do once you have some control and you have the basic mechanics of the piece you're learning down, and then you can kind of zoom in on the details a bit more about how you're going to play it. Building from what I was talking about earlier, we want to learn to recognize the sound of familiar musical elements we're using to, again, let your memory of the sound of the music help guide you. And this can really help you learn new music more effectively and quicker. You're becoming more fluent. And of course, this helps too with things like working out music by ear, writing your own music, and improvisation. I'm going to name a few things here, but over on Patreon, I'm going to be doing a kind of companion video to this where I'll be taking some examples of these things and going through them in a bit more detail. Patreon's a really great way to help support the channel, and for that you can get extra videos like this one, lots more, and guided practice videos and things. Thanks to everyone who's signed up to that and people who have been before. Like I say, there's lots of extra stuff over there and lots I'm going to be adding this year. Okay, so earlier I mentioned notes moving up or down, listening to the shape of the way notes move around. So with some more experience of paying attention to this kind of stuff, some ear training and things, we can get accustomed to trying to hear more specifically how far notes are moving. To start with, how many notes of the scale, for instance, they've moved up or down. Does a melody move around in seconds, so like next door in the scale? Or maybe there's a part that moves around in thirds, so skipping a note of the scale. When you get used to hearing those different leaps and you can hear in your head what the music does next, you're listening to the sound, again that can guide you and remind you what's coming next, where to move next on the piano. We can also get used to hearing things like broken chords and arpeggios, so patterns moving around only using the notes of a particular chord, like this F major for example. Overall, this only has the sound of an F major chord. There's no other notes that aren't in the chord, no other colours. So knowing and hearing that, getting used to that sound, again, guides you through. Getting used to hearing the sound of different types of chord helps guide us. Getting used to the sound of different chord progressions helps guide us as well. This kind of thing really does go hand in hand with learning a bit of basic theory stuff, and we can really just think of theory here as labeling things so you can find them again. I've got videos on the channel as well, learning how to number the chords in a key, which is a super useful thing to do. We want to get used to the sound of different types of scales and certainly have a strong awareness of being able to recognize them on the keyboard. And then with experience, again, we can start to get used to sometimes hearing where in the key the note of the melody is landing on. The easier one for beginners to get is the first note of the scale, the tonic, as this sounds like home. So in the key of F, the note F sounds like home. If you hear the melody resolving and going to the tonic, going to the first note of the scale, you're reminded to go there. And we can also learn to hear when a melody exclusively sticks inside the sound of the scale you're using, or when it uses a note that goes outside of the scale. If you've got used to the sound of the scale and then suddenly you hear something different, you know to look elsewhere to find that note. The more experience you have of music, paying attention to music, actively listening to music, learning how certain kinds of sounds were created, how to label things, learning a bit of basic theory, you build up a library, you build up a vocabulary. It doesn't have to be complicated to start with. You start with some basic things. You can get used to certain patterns, certain kinds of riffs that you've used in another piece of music. And with experience, it makes stuff easier to learn. I hope that was helpful. Let me know down in the comments if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.